thank everybody for attending. It's a pleasure to be here before Engineers Nova Scotia to address what I think is a very relevant and important topic, and certainly timely given events, particularly over the last week. I'll quickly again reintroduce myself. I'm Matt Saunders. I'm a partner at Cox & Palmer in Halifax, practicing in data privacy and cybersecurity law, as well as commercial litigation. Today's webinar presentation is titled To Pay or Not to Pay, Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Issues in an Age of Ransomware 2.0. Before I get started, I mentioned there were a few housekeeping issues that I just want to address. First and foremost, today's presentation is being recorded. As I mentioned, given the sunny blue skies we have outside, we want to make sure that today's presentation can be shared and viewed more widely after the fact. So it is being recorded, and I just wanted everybody to know that. A copy of my PowerPoint slides will also be made available to both participants and members to view at a later date and use as a point of reference. When it comes to questions and answers, I'd like today's presentation to be at least somewhat interactive or as much as possible. And so there is the chat function that is available. And I believe I've added a quick chat, just a welcome to everybody, so that if you do have questions over the course of the presentation, please don't hesitate to either raise a hand or use the chat function. I'll do as good a job as I can in terms of addressing the questions as they come in. Alternatively, if you want to hold off until the end of the presentation, you can certainly do so. We'll have time at the end for a Q&A session. And given the lovely weather, if we do finish early and everybody does want to get out of the online world and into the real world, happy to log off and everybody can enjoy the rest of the day. So without further ado, I'll get things started. As I mentioned, cybersecurity is very topical. It's very relevant. And there are, I would say, good ways of doing things in terms of planning and preparing for these types of events. And then there is this, which is probably not the best approach, a little bit too transparent in terms of password protections and security protocols. But I still see Post-it notes taped to hard drives and laptops, and certainly would discourage that type of approach when dealing with cybersecurity matters. I did want to kick off the discussion, though, with a bit of interaction, and I wondered if anyone in the group would be willing to answer the following question. When you see this type of screen, what would you do, or what would some of those immediate first rapid response steps would you consider, whether on your own, on a personal device, or if you're in the workplace or at a site that had this type of screen flash across your tech, what would you do? And as I said, the chat function is open. If anybody wants to, again, chime in, there is certainly no wrong answer in this case, because I'm looking forward to getting a bit of feedback or even some questions in terms of what does this screen even mean? And we'll get to that over the course of the presentation. But certainly want to put that out there because this is a topic that we're going to address over the course of today's discussion. And if no one feels brave today in putting something out there, that's certainly fine. But pay close attention to this screen. Consider some of the language that's used. The color red is pretty particular, and we're going to get into some of the nuts and bolts about why this is such an issue right now, why ransomware is so important to pay attention to, and what are some very practical things that you can do when dealing with this type of situation. So today's agenda is fairly straightforward. As I said, we're going to be addressing the ransomware risk. We're going to also be looking closely at, well, you know, why should you care? Why bother dealing with something that may have never happened to you, may not be front and center in terms of your day-to-day business, your client's business. Certainly, we're going to touch on the costs. That factor alone is reason enough on why ransomware and cybersecurity and data privacy matters should be important and should be paid close attention to. We're going to touch on some very real stories of data loss to provide some real-world context to the issue. I mentioned ransomware once, but we're going to talk about ransomware 2.0 and how the threat has evolved and what that means in terms of how best to respond. We're going to pay close attention to legal obligations that exist in Canada when it comes to data breaches, how the landscape certainly I had hoped would change to a greater degree in Canada. And unfortunately, that's not going to be the case, at least federally. But there are some provincial changes on the horizon and leaving room for optimism there. And then at the end of the presentation, we're going to spend some time, as I mentioned, dealing with some practical steps that you can take either individually or within your own businesses to plan for, prepare for, respond to, and recover from data incidents and cybersecurity matters. But before going on, I want to thank one of the participants for raising a really good point about what not to do if you were to see that screen that kicked things off. And just going back to it, one point, don't click any of the links on screens that come up like that. A great point to raise. A follow-up point, definitely contact your IT department right away if at the workplace. Also a great first step to take. And whether it's ransomware or other types of cyber security issues, phishing is another that we're going to deal with. Clicking links can be such a bad step to take because that first click may be how the ransomware attack even gets started. So it's good to have that awareness, and thanks for the input from the participants. So to set the stage, I wanted to, sound the alarm a little bit because ransomware and cybersecurity issues, most recently voiced by the FBI director before Congress and in public testimony, suggested that the complexities arising from how to respond to ransomware attacks is really on par now with the level of government cooperation and responding to a threat on par with 9/11. Now, pre-pandemic, there were a number of data breaches that had already taken place. You can think back to the billion-plus users that were breached by way of the Yahoo incident. Marriott Hotels had over 500 million members and their personal information accessed, which some consider to have been a state-sponsored attack that was potentially tied to other incidents involving U.S. government employee databases in the mid-2010s. And then we had the incidents involving improper personal information use on the part of Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica incident. All this to say, we're now in a phase where ransomware and data breaches are truly next level. And ransomware 2.0 incidents, which we'll talk about in greater detail later in the presentation, are taking it to the next level in terms of how traditional ransomware attacks have evolved beyond simply locking computers, and they've become much more sophisticated and much more complex. They've also become much more costly, and it's really the domino effect that these types of incidents have from very significant and complex government entities, for example, by way of the SolarWinds incident, which happened at the end of last year, but which can trickle down to impact significant pieces of critical infrastructure. This was the case with the Colonial Pipeline shutdown along the eastern seaboard earlier this year by way of a ransomware attack. And most recently, as I mentioned earlier, just this past Friday, the CASIA attack, which impacted CASIA and its monitoring systems for its clients, many of which are what are called managed service providers, which are third-party providers for many small to medium-sized businesses around the world, that use their services to effectively externally support IT infrastructure, virus updates, and the overall oversight of their systems. The reason why CASIA is such a big deal is because of the way in which the attack unfolded. And as I said, that domino impact of a supply chain attack where a small number of CASIA's clients were originally impacted, but because of their interconnectedness with the online nature of things, you have cases, for example, in Sweden right now, where their number one grocery store chain had to close for upwards of 3 to 4 days because they used CASIA systems in support of how their cashiers and tech operated. Well, when the red screens were engaged, the caches wouldn't open, you can't sell food, and the stores remain closed. Their public broadcaster was also impacted to the point where national security officials within Sweden had to go on the air and comment about the significance and the severity of the attack. Now, interestingly, Canada is certainly no exception when it comes to ransomware. Attacks were on the rise before the pandemic. A survey of Canadian chief technology officers found that 88% of businesses in 2019 had already suffered a data breach. What's interesting is that over the course of the pandemic, the surge of ransomware and phishing attacks has only increased, and sophistication has grown, and they've been very COVID specific. We've seen a number of clients receive email messages, spear phishing attacks, highlighting early at the outset of the pandemic. Click here to access surplus personal protective equipment. Click here for more information about how to access your vaccine. When screening processes were being put into place during initial reopening for work phases, it was interesting how hackers took advantage, particularly of remote work and working outside of the office, going after employees who arguably have lower IT security systems in place at home, may have not onboarded properly or may have been disconnected from their IT teams, and really taking advantage of that situation to the point where just last year, 30% of Canadian businesses were hit with some type of COVID-19 cyber-related incident. But again, why does that matter? Why does having cybersecurity protections and data privacy plans in place, what is the big deal? Well, really, the bottom line is that data incidents are expensive. They've been around for a long time. Interestingly enough, one of the first viruses came about in the 1970s, the creeper virus, but it was actually created for purposes of testing internal security protocols. AOL was one of the first victims of a phishing attack in the 1990s when it was reaching its peak in popularity. Hackers paid close attention to its membership numbers going up. It was also being used for illegal downloads and pirated materials, and of course was primed for the pickings of cyber criminals back in the day. What's the result of now 2+ decades of these types of incidents is that the amount of money being spent to respond to cybersecurity events to better prepare for them is skyrocketing. From 2012 to 2019, you can see that the global spend was in the range of $62 to $150 billion. But the forecast going forward is that in the next 10 years, we're seeing and likely to see a rise of 65%. To the tune of a maximum spend of $250 billion. And those dollar amounts are realistic when you consider that the actual cost of global cybercrime this year alone was effectively $6 trillion. So again, it's not just specific to international players. Canada also suffers costs as a result of data incidents. The average cost of a data breach in Canada, as estimated by IBM and the Ponemon Institute in 2020, was almost $6.5 million. So again, significant numbers, not inconsequential, and really reinforcing the importance of planning well in advance. So bottom line, you can't shrug off the importance of planning in advance for a data breach. It's so much better to be ahead of the game than to deal with a red screen at 12:01 on a Sunday morning, or systems being locked down and scrambling to try to respond and get operations back in order. And to be honest, the importance of planning for cyber incidents doesn't necessarily deal specifically with tech-related risks. Certainly, there are other human-associated causes of data breaches. One of the participants mentioning not clicking suspicious links. Again, human error, negligence or otherwise, can be front and center in terms of getting the ball rolling on a ransomware incident impacting your systems and operations. But some of these other examples in terms of leaving sensitive digital information or tech in an unlocked car while you go grab a coffee. CSIS had major issues with that back in the 90s and 2000s, albeit on a much more sensitive scale when dealing with national security matters, but certainly something that can happen and does happen on a daily basis when someone thinks they can just pop into Starbucks to get a coffee and then come back and their briefcase with their laptop is gone. But even something as innocent as clicking reply all without thinking and sharing sensitive information, potentially sensitive personal information, with those who shouldn't have access to it, can result in potential breach notification obligations, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But it's all this to say that there are so many different sources of where a cyber incident can take place, be it from human error or be it from a malicious threat actor, that it's just incredibly important to remain nimble and vigilant in recognizing the threats as they could impact your organization. So as I mentioned at the outset, the focus of today's presentation really is to deal with the more recent issue of ransomware 2.0. But I thought it would be helpful to just talk about, what am I talking about when speaking of ransomware? And really what we're talking about is effectively software that's bad, malware that can be deployed to lock your computer, encrypt files, and in the case of ransomware, of course, lead to a ransom demand, either for the release of the information that's been encrypted or the unlocking of your systems if it's been a more significant attack. Now, in the early days, it's interesting, hackers would actually create and deploy the malware, and then similar to Geek Squad, put on their IT response gear, arrive on site and look like the knight in shining armor coming to save the day, even though they were the ones that effectively created the incident and then benefited from being paid to solve the problem. And it's that payment piece that is just so critical. I mean, we talked about some of those numbers, but the average ransomware payment now is in the low six figures, $220,000, just to get something back or to get systems online. But it's really the issue with ransomware 2.0 and the new normal that we're seeing that is getting governments, security agencies, multinational corporations incredibly concerned about the size and scope of these incidents. The Cassia incident that I mentioned earlier, for example, started with the cyber criminals, Russian-speaking group Revil, reaching out to affected customers on a small to medium-size range of things. They were offering ransoms in the $40,000 to $50,000 range. For larger businesses that were impacted, the ransoms were in the low millions, again, to receive the decryption key to unlock the data and or their systems. But as of Monday, the hackers came out publicly and said, look, everybody, if you want the master switch to unlock it all, we'll take 70 million in digital currency. Thank you very much. And again, the lucrative nature of this business and the operations that cyber criminals are now engaging in from a size and scope perspective really ties into 2.0 and why it's so critical. In the traditional sense, ransomware would normally simply encrypt the information. There would be no necessary exfiltration, and it would be a ransom to be paid to decrypt that information. But what's happening now, particularly as data breach laws evolve and the obligations of businesses when it comes to reporting and or notifying affected individuals if their personal information had been breached, cyber criminals are cluing into those obligations, and they're now not just encrypting the information, but they're downloading it and copying it and storing it before it gets encrypted, so that even if the victim turns around to the hackers and says, look, we're not paying the ransom, we've got backups, we're fine, go pound sand, the hackers turn around and say, well, that's great. Within 48 hours, if you don't now pay an even higher ransom, we're going to post the information on the dark web for sale, or we're going to post it so your customers can see all of their personal information that has been breached because of your negligence. And it really imposes a new level of onus, of crises on those organizations that are suffering from a ransomware 2.0 attack that really adds to the level of complexity in terms of how best to respond. Now, I would like to point out that law enforcement has improved its capabilities in terms of dealing with these types of ransomware attacks. The issue of whether or not to pay a ransom is front and center for them. Certainly, they discourage the payment because in their minds, it just facilitates and encourages more ransomware attacks and different cyber criminals to come out of the woodwork. But in the case of the ransom that was paid by Colonial after its pipeline was shut down, I believe the FBI ended up getting almost most, if not all, of the 4 million plus in ransom that was paid. So there are techniques to get the currency back. That there are means of going after the cyber criminals, but again, these are very large-scale international operations, and for those smaller to medium-sized businesses that are impacted but very far down on the supply chain, that waiting for law enforcement to save the day might not be a viable option, particularly if your systems are down and business operations are costing too much to stay offline. Another risk that I wanted to flag was from the perspective of phishing. And we touched on this a little bit earlier in terms of, again, how hackers can effectively attempt to impersonate a legitimate person, someone, a coworker, senior manager, a client, to effectively trick you into divulging further information, downloading malicious code that can then in turn result in a ransomware attack at a later date. And these types of attacks are very clever. Again, at one point last year, a new type of phishing attack was happening where Google invites would be sent to Gmail users, for example, that would automatically upload to their calendars, and hackers would use that calendar invite again, and embed a link that someone not paying close attention would think that, oh, I've got this appointment or this event to go to. Click here, download my tickets, and then lo and behold, the hacker has them. And it just highlights the importance of paying close attention to those links when they come in. You know, if you get something, for example, from the CRA that seems a little bit odd, the CRA having been hacked themselves over the last year, hover over the link, make sure it's from the CRA, and better yet, don't necessarily click. Just pick up the phone and call the person, whether it's a client, whether it's a friend, it's a colleague, you know, anything that seems suspicious, particularly if it's requesting your personal information, your login information, any sensitive information. Don't click the link and don't share it over email. Better to call that individual and find out if the request is authentic to begin with. So before I get into any real world examples, I just wanted to quickly reach out and see if there were any questions or comments from the floor. Again, really appreciate the initial input in the comment section. And if not, then we'll just move on. As I said earlier, I want to flag a couple of real world examples because, again, Russian speaking cyber criminals, the FBI, global ransomware attacks. Again, how does that actually impact you and your business, your clients, and your colleagues? Well, from a real world example, I wanted to provide a few. Some local, some more across Canada. The first being from Alberta in terms of how ransomware attacks can affect universities. MacEwan University in Alberta is a prime example. They had a range of construction completed on campus and owed their contractors $12 million. Administrative staff received an email requesting a banking information change from whom they thought to be their contractor. Again, it was a sophisticated looking email, had all of the right invoicing and billing information. But again, they were saying, look, we're switching banks or we're switching accounts. Can you please wire the final contracting funds to a different account? There was no follow-up directly with the client. 3 checks were wired out. And a week later, the actual construction company called the university and said, well, why haven't we been paid? It was a social engineering scam. Interestingly enough, there were upwards of 14 other businesses and educational institutions that were hit with a similar type of attack. Unfortunately, MacEwan was the one that was hit the hardest. And the investigation by law enforcement reached from Montreal all the way to Hong Kong, took over 2 years to get effectively 92% of the funds returned to the university, and it cost $250,000 to do just that. Closer to home, a real world example from last November is St. John. Many of you may recall that its municipal tech infrastructure was hit in November of 2020. Everything from email and phone services were shut down. But again, customer-facing services in terms of paying for parking, seeking out a building permit, they were also locked. And it was a huge alert status red situation for the municipality. Interestingly enough, they were faced with a ransom request of $17 to $20 million. The municipality said, no, we are not paying, and instead took themselves offline, spent upwards of $3 million to get back online. And I believe it was just last month that their new infrastructure became active. And to their advantage, they had cyber insurance coverage through AIG, and had most, if not all, of the bill paid. I think there was an outstanding fee to taxpayers of about $400,000. But I did want to point out that over $1 million alone was just spent on the immediate containment and recovery of the incident. And what's so important is that it's not just the dollar figure, but the time, the resources, and the speed with which forensic investigators and cybersecurity experts need to be effectively deployed at the outset of the incident, in those instances where a ransom is not going to be paid, to properly respond, and in this case, getting the municipality back online. And you know, I can't sit here and talk about cybersecurity without the risk that my own profession faced and continues to face. And so one example I wanted to flag was from a few years ago, but a global law firm out of its Vancouver office was engaged in a real estate deal across the Pacific. An associate was assisting, and there was a portion of a mortgage on the deal that was due. The client, as the law firm believed, had requested again to change banks. They were moving from an old account, which was being audited, and wanted the funds to be deposited elsewhere. The firm in this case actually contacted the client to verify that their client was engaged. And interestingly enough, because of the level of social engineering that took place, the third-party threat actor was able to impersonate the client to the point that the law firm made the transfer of $2.5 million, unfortunately not to the client. The dispute ended up before the courts because in this case, the law firm's insurer, based on the coverage and based on the social engineering that took place, actually refused to pay out. And as of at least 2019, that dispute was still before the courts, again, highlighting the litigation risks that can come from these types of events. Now, I just wanted to flag a question that came up in the chat regarding, is preventing malware and ransomware simply a means of education and awareness of users? A great question. And, as we get through the presentation and highlighting some of the steps that can be taken, it is certainly one of the steps, education and awareness being one of those steps. But there are more that can be done, and we'll get to those shortly. But thank you for your question. So I wanted to quickly touch on some of the legal obligations because, again, there are real-world instances very close to home where ransomware incidents have taken place. They can be costly, but it's the after-the-fact legal obligations that may also have financial consequences if those law obligations are not met. For those of you who don't know, there is a federal private sector privacy legislation, that's PIPEDA, which has been on the books for 20 plus years and applies to those organizations that collect, use, disclose personal information for a commercial purpose. There are some other provinces that have their own privacy legislation for the private sector. Nova Scotia is not one of them. And so as a result, PIPEDA would come into play for any type of commercial activity where personal information is, again, collected, used, disclosed, or retained. Now, there had been hopes, as I said at the start of the presentation, for the legal landscape in Canada to change significantly because that's already happened in Europe. In 2018, the General Data Protection Regulation went into effect, which really is the gold standard internationally for data privacy rights, really putting the onus on organizations to better protect, better secure personal information that's collected in the private sector. And there are a number of new laws south of the border as well that are focused on, again, the privacy-related issues from a consumer protection perspective. Now, when it comes to Canada, though, the state of federal law and its evolution is not good. Bill C-11, which was to have been the evolution of PIPEDA, or the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, has not passed and will not pass given Parliament's summer recess. There are also significant indications that a fall election is going to take place. And so with, albeit that stalling of changes to federal privacy law regulations, provinces are taking it on their own to advance things. Ontario is proposing its own private sector privacy legislation. Quebec has proposed and is quickly advancing Bill 64, its privacy law, which is very similar to GDPR. Closer to home in Nova Scotia, Premier Rankin gave an indication in March that our privacy legislation, which is also tied into our Freedom of Information and Access to Information law, FOIPOP, would be reviewed by the Attorney General and the Department of Justice. But again, there have been no updates or developments since early this spring on where that could go provincially. So what does that mean? Well, it means, again, because PIPEDA applies federally and the new law did not come into place, breach notification regulations are still in effect, and they came into effect as of November 2018. And these obligations, again, amount to what happens if a data breach takes place or a breach of security safeguards under the law that has a connection or could impact the disclosure of personal information. First and foremost, breaches that amount to a real risk of significant harm. I'll explain what that means in a second. Any type of breach that amounts to that level must be reported to the Office of the Federal Privacy Commissioner and may require notification to affected individuals. Now, it's really a two-part test in terms of what that means, and I'm happy to chat with anybody who's on today's presentation after the fact about, again, some of the minute details of how you can work through that test. But real risk in this sense would require you to consider the sensitivity of the information at issue that may have been breached as a result of the security incident, and the probability of it being misused. So to put it in context, a really great example is, for example, if you had personal information, say somebody's address, and you also had their subscription information to the Chronicle Herald. Okay, that from a real risk perspective, not necessarily all that sensitive. But if you did have somebody's address and their subscription information to some other type of publication, magazine that may be of a more controversial subject matter, then certainly the sensitivity there for a real risk goes up. And then when you factor in significant harm, you have to look very closely at the type of incident. For example, if someone lost a device versus it being stolen from their car, or if there were a ransomware attack that involved a malicious threat actor and you knew there was some level of malicious activity involved in the event, then certainly the significant harm index goes up, because the risk of bodily harm and humiliation or damage to reputation resulting from that incident, when coupled with the information that may have gone out the door, could result in the notification obligations being engaged. And so what do those obligations involve? They involve notice in writing in a form as soon as feasible. Now, that doesn't mean within 2 hours. GDPR in Europe, for example, has a 72-hour requirement for notification in most circumstances. In Canada, it's more flexible, but it still requires that notification. And I've provided on the slide just a general overview of the information under the law that is to be included in that letter, email or otherwise. There's also a need to notify other organizations that may be able to mitigate harm. So for example, if you receive personal information from another entity, a client, for example, but the breach has happened on your end, there is a requirement to notify the other organization that may have given you that information, because the domino will then spread for their potential notification requirements to their clients as well. Failing to report to the Office of the Federal Privacy Commissioner can result in fines of low 5 figures up to low 6 figures. There is also a requirement to keep records of all breaches. And that's a requirement that we'll touch on in terms of some of those practical steps that you can take in advance of dealing with an incident after the fact. And I would stress that anybody who's interested in data breach obligations, getting some advanced planning done, the OPC's website has a slew of very useful tools, many of which are in Word and are easily downloadable and adaptable. And I would encourage you to take a look at those toolkits, because again, it's a great first step to becoming better prepared. And truly, there are very straightforward planning principles that I'm going to close out with to share with you all in terms of taking some active practical steps to be ready for not the if and arguably not the when, because many data incidents have probably already taken place either within your business or for clients that you work with, colleagues that you know. And so these are things that are happening on a minute-to-minute basis. But it is very easy to at least get the ball rolling to become better prepared, limit your risk and liability, and also reduce the amount of money that would have to be spent to respond to an incident without being prepared. So the first step that I wanted to touch on quickly is mitigation. And really the best thing that you can do is to look closely under the hood within your own organization, within your own business, and assess what you have. What types of data do you have? Where is the data? Who can access the data? Is it compartmentalized so that you've got different levels of sensitivities and different levels of accessibility, and looking closely from an audit perspective as to why that matters. Then looking closely at the types of threats. Revol might not be a realistic threat for your organization, your clients or otherwise. But cyber criminals on a smaller scale, phishing attacks, going back to the point about education and awareness of users, it may be that that's really the priority step that should be taken in terms of educating staff and making them better aware of the risks that are out there. And another important step to take at the outset is to look at what others within your own industry are doing. And I think from Engineers Nova Scotia perspective, this is a great opportunity to talk across the province and across other associations across the country when it comes to best practices. Are there other plans that have been put into place amongst your colleagues province to province? Can you share those resources? Again, that's a really great first step to do, because again, it just facilitates cooperation and collaboration, and it certainly helps in not necessarily reinventing the wheel, which I'll come to in a second. So second step is preparedness, and I say plan to plan, because the reason for that is that, you know, I've been in emergency management since the early 2000s. I've been in data privacy law for a number of years here in Halifax, and the idea of just putting together something that sits in a binder and goes on the shelf and that's all you need to do, that's the exact opposite of what you need to do. Really, it starts with, as I said, assessing and figuring out what you have, and then building a truly practical plan that is operational, it's scalable, and your staff also know what to do, your colleagues know what to do. And so front and center is building a team. It may be a team of 1, it may be a team of 5, it may be a team of 50, but really based on the size of your operations, one element that must be engaged are your IT resources, whether they're external or internal. I've worked with many clients where they're so keen to prepare for a cyber incident, but the last group they call are their IT staff, their IT experts, and they should be front and center engaged from day one. I mentioned looking to best practices and precedents. The OPC is a prime example. Our provincial office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner, while their resources are more focused on public bodies, there's still great tools that can be adaptable in the private sector, and I would highly encourage you to look at that, their website as well. We mentioned the need to develop a practical and an actionable plan, but it's so critical to also review and test that plan. Tabletop exercises are a great way to just sit down, maybe blow the dust off it if you haven't engaged it in a few months or years, and really see, okay, does this still work? Maybe your organization operations have grown. You need to factor in new resources, the expansion of your own tech infrastructure. You're only able to make your plan more practical by rooting it in how your operations are presently happening. You certainly want to update relevant policies, and to pay or not to pay is front and center. That's the title of this presentation, and the reason why I did that is we've come across in our work clients dealing with ransomware incidents after the fact. They may even have a plan in place, but what they haven't talked about internally is, do we pay the ransom, or is that like negotiating with terrorists and we're not going to do it? Have we worked with our insurer to determine what their position would be? Do we want to reach out to law enforcement? What are the steps that we're going to take if we're faced with having to open a Bitcoin account to transfer over significant amounts of digital currency? Having that conversation before things have gone sideways is so much easier to do than at the 11th hour when stress is running high, tensions are running high, and people can be very, very intense and maybe not reasonable in terms of what the most realistic position to take is when dealing with a ransom request. Dealing with that policy well before is critical, and will only make the response go more smoothly. When it comes to external support, what I mean there is that you can't do it on your own. And when I mention municipalities, universities, law firms, cyber incidents require external support, and the importance of having external legal counsel, of having a forensic investigator and or resources ready to go, crisis communications, and a cyber insurance policy, which we'll touch on quickly. Your cyber coverage may deal with all of those issues, but again, you want to address those points well before something goes sideways. And I'll quickly highlight the importance of external legal counsel from the perspective of privilege. I mentioned earlier the litigation risks that can come about from a data breach, particularly if personal information is involved. If you have external legal counsel retained and coordinating the response, perhaps even from a preventative perspective and coordinating your planning efforts, if something goes sideways and they've been involved from the get-go, you will at least have a leg to stand on if things were to proceed to litigation, and you could claim solicitor-client privilege or potentially litigation privilege over those plans, communications, emails, notifications, etc. And so it's very important to think about again, the scope of risk, the type of threats that you face, and then also pay close attention to those external resources that you may need to pull in if things go wrong. And so from a cyber insurance perspective, I just wanted to highlight how, again, general insurance policies, particularly over the last few years and the growth of the cyber insurance market, you may not be able to rely on them. Sometimes earlier criminal riders, for example, might be able to be relied upon, but of late that's not necessarily the case. And so particularly because cyber attacks have become more frequent, especially over COVID-19, they've affected premiums. While the product lines have become certainly more diverse, they certainly have also become more costly. But when you're dealing with typical types of coverage, I did want to flag this for everyone in terms of really the two categories that you want to be looking at if you're interested in speaking with your broker and looking at what options are out there. From a first-party coverage perspective, you're looking at direct losses and out-of-pocket expenses as a result of the response to a cyber incident. So again, that's really looking at, okay, something goes wrong. What is it going to cost to get things up and running again, restoring systems or data, retaining a forensic investigation firm. We gave the example of St. John previously and the dollars and cents involved there. Thankfully, they had coverage and they were able to pay for it through their policy. But even event management and crisis communications or PR resources could fall under first-party coverage. But the second category, when it comes to third-party coverage, that's when you're dealing with the external, the defense and the liability that could result, particularly from a data breach involving sensitive client information and or sensitive personal information. So there you're looking at coverage that would cover defense costs for litigation, potential costs resulting from a regulatory investigation, for example, if the Federal Privacy Commissioner were involved, and lastly, the cost of preparing for that response and any potential tribunal or court-related investigations as a result of the regulatory breach. Again, another step then from the response perspective, and that just having happened, then you want to activate the plan. As I mentioned before, the immediate involvement of external legal counsel and your external resources. You're going to really want to focus on containment. You in those very early hours and minutes of locking things down, determining the scope of the incident, making sure that it's contained and not spreading further, and factoring and tying that into your communications response. What's so critical at the outset is really communicating to your own staff, your own colleagues, so that they understand and appreciate the scope of what's happening. We talked about the red screen at the front end and having the start to your day opening up where you can't access anything, and a clock is ticking down asking for Bitcoin to be deposited. Those initial communications are so critical. The notification piece then may come into play in terms of engaging the regulator along with record keeping issues. Certainly, you're going to want to keep track of evidence. And again, that's where the benefit of both external counsel and a forensic investigation firm can come into play, because you certainly don't want to be accused of either tampering with or not protecting evidence if there's litigation on the horizon. And then lastly, and arguably the most important step out of all, is the recovery. It's really, once the dust is settled, taking the time to sit down with your team, sit down with your colleagues, and really engage in some formal lessons learned reporting. Your external teams and resources, if you pull them in, they will provide you with those reports. But you want to also debrief with your staff and the responders who had to deal with things on the fly, and look closely what worked, what didn't, what needs to go. And then update and reassess your plan and policies as necessary. So with that and 8 minutes left, I thought I'd open it up for any further questions and hopefully answers from my end from anybody on the virtual floor. And certainly happy to take questions offline as well if you'd rather follow up with me via email. One question has come in is it safe to use a web browser to store a password? Personally, I don't do that. My concern, and this really goes to sort of an overarching issue, is unless you pay particular attention to the type of browser you're using and their own privacy settings, you can be very surprised at either the scope with which they're tracking your own personal information, and the level of security that they have. I go back to Yahoo is a prime example of a massive breach in the billions, and considering whether or not there are other appropriate ways in which passwords can be stored. There are a number of services that effectively you just have one password to unlock, and you can store all of your passwords in the app. That's one way of doing things. The other way is, if you do need to store a password in a browser, is really investigate, contrast to compare. From Google Chrome to DuckDuckGo. Same thing when it comes to messaging apps. Is WhatsApp better than Signal? It's all about really looking under the hood and seeing what's there in terms of both protecting your personal information and protecting your ability to access it. Thank you for your question, though. There's another question regarding jurisdiction, and thank you for that. If each province has their own set of privacy laws, do we in Nova Scotia need to worry about FOIPOP, or, for example, Ontario's laws if we deal with customers there? Really great question. The answer is yes. If you're dealing with personal information of residents of another province, and I would pay particular attention to Alberta, and BC and Quebec, then in the present sense, then I would say yes, given their privacy laws specific to the private sector. Things are changing, as I said, in Quebec. Ontario, it does not yet have a private sector privacy law. And so, again, they're sort of in a similar boat to Nova Scotia, although a little bit further down the road in the public consultation about how their new law is going to look. But if you are dealing with personal information of clients outside of the confines of Nova Scotia, then it's important to appreciate and understand or seek counsel about what the particular privacy laws within that province and how they apply to their residents' personal information could impact your own business operations. Thanks again for that question too. Well, everybody, look, I again want to thank you all for being here on a very sunny day, of which we've had very few in July. It was a pleasure speaking with you all. Would certainly look forward to hearing from anyone who has follow-up questions, or if you receive the slide deck and you review and want to reach out, don't hesitate to do so. As I said, I've had a lot of fun putting this together. I don't mean it to be all doom and gloom, but really it's an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure when it comes to just looking at the issue, looking at the risk, and getting yourselves ready. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You may have your own business continuity plan, and you can really just piggyback a cybersecurity or data breach response plan from that. But again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.